Can everybody see that we're recording? Okay, cool. Thanks. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about framework and impact calculus at this lecture. I don't know if you've heard about framework, but this is an advanced lecture, so hopefully you'll be coming into this lecture with an idea of what topicality is. That'll be helpful, and also just in general how impact debate works. You don't have to know specifics or anything; just you need to know what impacts are. As long as you know that, that'll be fine. So let's get into the structure of how we're going to be doing this lecture. I'd say about 70% of it is going to be just me telling you what framework and impact calculus are. If you look at the first 5 points, the first three, we're just going to be talking about what framework is, how to employ it, how to use it, supporting and responding to non-topical AFs. And then we're going to be going into impact calculus and how that can be split into framing and impact calc in itself. And then I found that impact calculus, it really can't be taught, just spoken to, and then you automatically infuse the knowledge yourself. So we're going to be doing a drill afterwards. And in order to do that drill, you're going to need a document that has a ton of cards in it. It's in the classroom. You can access it yourself once we get there. So first, we're going to be getting into what framework is. And if I can speak personally, framework is my favorite argument that you can use in debate because it's the most meta argument that you can use in debate, in that it's debate about debate itself. It's a debate about what we should talk about in debate. And so most of the time, you won't necessarily think about framework because if we assume that you're the neg in this case, you come into the debate room and the AF prevents their own 1AC argument. And most of the time, you as the neg are probably going to agree with it. For example, if you're an LDR policy, the AF might propose a plan text. They might follow the resolution in some way. And you as the neg might have prepared a case that is just a direct response to that, saying that the policy in itself is bad. But suppose that AF comes into the room and presents an argument that you're unfamiliar with. They present, for example, an advocacy in which they don't support the resolution and they don't offer a plan text. Now, you might not necessarily have enough evidence or enough cases to adequately establish clash with that argument. So what are you going to do in that case? In that case, you believe that the model that is presented by the AF, in this case, the rejection of the resolution, is bad. And so you need an argument structure in order to argue that it's bad, in order to argue that the model of debate presented by the AF is bad in itself. And so you're going to run framework. Framework is just this all-encompassing argument that can be run as a T-shell. It can just be run as a single line. It can be run as a TVA. There are a lot of different ways to run framework. But at its heart, it's asking the question, why is debate valuable? Why do we go to universities, that we've never been to before and enter into a room for 40 minutes or for an hour and talk to somebody that we never met before and being judged by somebody that we've never met before? Why do we do that? And so we each have our own individual reasons as to why we do debate, but there are lots of variety between those reasons. And the reasons for those varieties can ultimately cause us to run different arguments in debate as well. For example, if we're just concerned with truth testing, that is, with finding out what is essentially true in the world outside of the debate round, then we might not necessarily care about plan text or the resolutions, because maybe those aren't conducible ways to learning about what's real in the world. We might come into the debate for research skills, that is, the ability to develop coherent arguments, to learn about academia and how research is conducted in the real world, so that once we, go to college and end up in a career in academia, we're better able to develop those skills. Or maybe we don't care about any of that. Maybe we just go into a debate room to have fun. We want to talk about things that we care about, that we're passionate about, and we don't care what happens after the 40 minutes are up. We just want to go in there and have a good time and learn. But all of these are different reasons for debating, and all of them lead to different arguments that you might run in debate. And because there's so many differences between the reasons why debaters choose to do debate, lead themselves to different arguments in debate as well. And so we're going to get into how that happens. Okay. So before we get into framework in itself, we should talk about how framework acts relative to the other arguments in debate. They don't all operate on the same level in that they don't all talk about the exact same thing per se. They're all argumentation, certainly, but we're not all arguing about the same thing. And so if you don't have a lot of experience with framework debate or, stuff like util debate or standards or whatever that is, you're probably only familiar with, I guess, a very shallow understanding of debate. But in reality, debate has several things called layers. I mean, they're not technically called this. A couple of years ago, one of the alumni at our schools, Andres de la Bruce, used this metaphor, I guess, to describe how debate works. And that there's a core layer that you have to win first before you ascend to higher layers in debate. And so when you think about these layers in debate, just know that the first and then the second and then the third and then the fourth layer in that order are in decreasing order of importance. And so in order to win the debate, you first have to win the first layer of debate, then you have to win the second layer of debate, then the third layer, and then the fourth layer. So even if you win the third and the fourth layers of debate, it doesn't matter if you've lost the first layer, because nothing after the first layer matters if you've lost at that point. Now, coming into the debate round, most of your debates, like 90% of your debate rounds, are just going to be preoccupied with third and the fourth layers. These are probably what you're familiar with if you haven't done framework debate before. It's just your standard offense and defense paradigm, in that you'll have a lot of off cases. Like if you're on the AF, it'll just be the 1AC that you present, and on the neg it might be opposing cases like DAs or CPs or theory or T that might just generally say why the plan that is presented by the AF or the rules that are presented by the AF are bad. In this case, you're not contesting the AF, the debater themselves. You're just contesting what they're talking about. And that goes the same with the fourth layer. That's just defense against anything that the opposing team presents. And so coming into the debate round, the reason why you don't typically talk about these first two layers is because you automatically agree that you're both operating on the same level in these first two layers. You might both agree that running a plain text is good, that talking about the state is good, that following the resolution is good, that debate in general is a good community. And so you don't have to talk about them. You already assume that they're true. But once in a while, you will come across a debater who doesn't necessarily disagree with you on these things. They might present a different value or value criterion, which is just something specific to LD and not other debates. Or they might present a different weighing mechanism. That is a different way of weighing different impacts that you might bring up in round. But framework operates even below this level of framing of, just a philosophical way of evaluating impacts. Framing is a way of evaluating the types of arguments that we present in debate and whether or not they have merit and whether or not they're even worth it. So even if I present the best possible plain text in round, even if I defend it flawlessly against any off case that the neg might present, or any case negs that the neg might present against my 1AC, if my neg also states that plain texts in themselves are bad, that following the resolution is bad, the debate as itself is not a good institution when we just blindly follow the resolution and blindly use the state in order to learn about the world, then none of that matters. It doesn't matter how good my plain text was. It doesn't matter how good my 1AC was. None of that matters if plain texts in themselves don't matter and aren't conducive to good debate and don't help us reap the good benefits that we should expect from debate. That's why framework is so critical. Because although you won't run it most of the time, like 80-90% of the time, you won't have to run it. When you do have to run it, you have to win it in order to win the debate round. That's why it's so critical. But I also recommend that you think about this argument outside of a debate context too. I know some of us, especially me when I first started debate, we didn't really interrogate why we were there. We just sort of, happened to be there. We thought it was a fun activity maybe. But it's important that you also think about debate outside of the debate round and the implications that it has, not just right now in the debate round itself, but also for your time in high school and what you want to gain out of high school, and ultimately beyond high school as well. What you want to gain out of debate in your career, in college, in academia, and whatever it is you ultimately end up pursuing. So when you run framework on the neg, that is when the AF presents a model of debate that you disagree with, you're going to run it as a standard topicality show. And I'm not going to go too in-depth into the structure because I assume that you already know that. But you're going to obviously begin with an interpretation and a definition. That is, you should say that the AF should be topical and provide a simple definition, for example, of the federal government, just to, explain what it means to be topical, because typically a resolution will have federal government doing something. And even if it's not, for example, if you're an LD and the topic isn't something to do that could be employed with state action, you should still provide a simple definition for the actor in this case. And the violation, this is pretty easy. The app is not topical. You don't have to be as technical with framework as you do typically with T or theory, just because in T and theory, technicalities abound. It's extremely important to use semantics to the best of your abilities. But with framework, the app will usually state loudly and proudly that they are not topical. And so totally, your interpretation and violation shouldn't take more than 15, 20 seconds tops, because it's just not that important. The most important stuff is going to be the third and the fourth arguments in your T-shell. Your standards and your voters. This is typically what they would call those arguments in T, but framework is organized a little bit differently. You'll see that it's organized much more like a DA, and that you're talking about specific disadvantages that the AF model of debate has. And so we're going to rebrand these arguments. They're the exact same things, but we're just going to give them new names. We're going to call them internal links and impacts, the same way that you would with a DA. And so when we talk about these arguments, the structure of this lecture, in the way that I'm going to present this structure of the T shell to you, I'm going to start from the bottom and go up. And then I'm going to talk about the impacts that we typically consider in a debate round. And then I'm going to talk about the warrants, the internal links that link the AFS model of debate to those impacts. So you probably heard this before if you've done T in theory, but our impacts in our debate rounds, when we talk about debate itself and why we do debate, are typically categorized into two main sections: education and fairness. Education is the first one, and it's a pretty simple one, and it's probably the most widespread reason why we do debate. And that's, we do debate to learn. We do debate to get an education and to learn more about the world around us, to maybe find something new, to learn about a new section of academia that we haven't heard about, to ultimately prepare us for the real world. All of these are the exact same general category of impact, in that we all just want to learn. That's why we do debate. And there's something about the AFS model that prevents us from doing that, that doesn't let us interrogate arguments to the maximum possible extent, that forces us to only consider maybe a very narrow section of academia, of literature, that prevents us from learning about a much broader perspective. This will vary wildly between debaters and what they personally feel is the purpose of education, or what's bad about the AFS model of debate, but they all they all come back to the same thing. And so when we talk about impacts in framework, we're typically going to split, we've already categorized them into either education or fairness, but even within that, we're going to split into two different types of impacts: in-round impacts and out-of-round impacts. In-round impacts only consider, as the name states, what's going on in the round itself. So basically, we live our lives, we're prepping outside of a debate round in our own homes, at our own schools, and then we go to a debate tournament, and nothing happens yet. Nothing matters yet. The only time that impacts start coming into play is the moment the timer starts on the 1AC, the moment that we actually start debating in round, and all of that ends once the 2AR occurs. And so all we're considering is the impact of debating itself. Nothing happens outside of the debate round. That's what in-round impacts means. The other category is out-of-round impacts. Out-of-round impacts is the exact opposite. It states that debates impacts don't happen inside the debate round itself. Debates impacts happen outside of the round, in our lives, in our careers, in our academic interests. All of the benefits of debate are reaped outside of rounds, in that we benefit from them, not in the debate round itself, but while we're living our normal lives day to day. And so education and fairness, as we'll see, will be split into these two types of arguments in two main ways. The first main general category of in-round and educational impacts that you see are called argument testing, or more commonly, truth testing arguments. And this argument basically says that the benefit of debate comes from interrogating arguments, of trying to get to that nugget of truth that maybe exists, at the center of the universe. And as long as debate best helps us to try and whittle our way down to that nugget of truth in the middle, it's doing the right thing. And so if you're on the neg, and for example, you believe that the AF is limiting themselves to something that isn't necessarily true, For example, if the app runs a plan text, but you know for a fact that plan text and the state in itself are not necessarily true entities, they don't actually consider the truth that exists in the universe, then you would believe that the app is not necessarily truth testing to the maximum possible extent. That is, they're not seeking truth through their model of debate. The main type of out-around impacts that occur under education, and this is by far the most common argument that you will see in a framework, is policymaking education. And in fact, when we go into responding to non-TA asks, we're primarily going to talk about policymaking. This is the most common, again, the most common reason for entering debate as well, the general reason for why we do debate. It's the argument that once we go out into the world, once we graduate high school, get into college, pursue academia, a lot of people in debate that do debate are ultimately going to go on to occupy the highest positions of government, whether it's federal, state, or local, in our world. And it doesn't just have to be government. It can also be, activism. It can be law. It can be academia itself. It doesn't matter what specific career we go into. The point is, a lot of us are going to ultimately end up having a very tangible, very meaningful impact on the world. And it's important that debate gives us the proper skills to become effective policymakers. This is, by and large, the most popular reason for entering debate. I don't know if you know this, but just as an example, who was it? I think it was Stephen Breyer and Jerry Brown were both friends in high school because they both debated each other repeatedly in Northern California. So that's just one example of how a lot of people in our government, and I think, JFK also did debate. I think, no, FDR didn't do debate. I don't know the specifics, but Ted Cruz did debate. There are a lot of people in government, a lot of popular people, well-known names, who did debate in high school. And so it indicates that although maybe not all of us are going to end up in academia or in high positions of government, a lot of people in government and high positions in academia did do debate. So it's important that in debate we have a proper structure that allows future policymakers to get the education that they need in order to become effective policymakers. We don't know who the policymakers are. The point is that the structure of debate as itself should support policymaking education. So that's the first category, education. The second main category is fairness. And this goes back to, when I was talking about potential reasons for debate. It relates to the idea that debate is fun. That the reason why we go into a debate round is not because we care about anything that's actually going on in the world. It's not because, we want to become effective policymakers in the future. It's not because, we want to think about what really lies at the center of the universe, what's really truthful. It's because we want to have fun. It's because debate is at its root a game, and games, by their very definition, require rules, and they require a balance of fairness between the two players. And there's something that the app does. There's something in the 1AC that breaks one of those rules or tilts the balance of debate in the app's favor. That makes it unfair. And so fairness, you might think, you might have intuitively think about this right now as I'm explaining what fairness is, but fairness really only has in-round impacts, because when you believe that fairness is the reason why you do debate, then nothing outside of the round itself actually matters. All that matters is what we consider an in-round impacts, that is competitive equity and procedural fairness. That is, do we follow the rules or do we not follow the rules? And we get to define what the rules are, certainly, but we have to make sure that the rules are followed and that the rules themselves are conducive to a balanced debate. And so there are many reasons why you might want to have procedural fairness in round. The first is competitive incentive. And so when we go into a debate round, we don't just, while away our time at home and school, not doing anything, and then just go into debate round, prepared with all of our knowledge just magically in our minds, right? We spend a lot of time preparing for rounds because we want to win. It might not necessarily be, the most, the most popular or necessarily the most admirable reason to do debate. But a lot of us here are literally just here to win. We just want to, see that we got a win on a round, that we didn't lose. We just want to receive that validation. It's not necessarily as grand or as amazing or as admirable as, wanting to go on and do, policymaking or becoming a government official or whatever. But the point is that realistically speaking, a lot of us here just want to win. And it's important to have that incentive in order to maintain some semblance of fairness. Because if you don't have a fair round, for example, if you know straight away that the app is automatically going to have a 60% chance of winning, and you on the neg are going to have a 40% chance of winning, are you really going to care enough to prepare for a debate round? Are you really going to take the time to do effective research to prepare solid cases if you're not even going to have fairness in the round itself? Probably not. It's like, if you find out, if you're playing a dice game with your friend and you're losing a lot, and you find out that the die is weighted, then you're probably not going to continue playing die with your friend. In the same way, if debate is not fair, then there's no incentive for debaters to win. And so the debate community loses the value that a lot of debaters apply to it. The second main in-round impact argument that you're going to hear about when people talk about fairness is this separation between debate and the real world. And we talked about this when we were explaining fairness in itself, but in-round impacts generally. But the idea is that a lot of people might say that debate will influence you, that you'll go on to use the skills that you gained in debate to help the world in your own specific way. But realistically, a lot of people aren't going to change as a result of doing debate. They're going to spend their 40 minutes in a round, and then as soon as the round ends, they're going to turn off. They're going to forget everything that happened in the round, except as it applies to the next debate. And the moment they graduate, they're not going to think about it again. There's this idea that although it might seem like debate helps us, ultimately it's just a way to take a game, to play a game. And as soon as the game is over, there's no other impacts on our own lives. The typical example or the typical illustration that people say is that as soon as the debate round ends, we go back to our homes, we eat our meals the same way that we did, we view the world the same way that we did before the debate round, and we don't actually learn anything. And although on the surface, it might seem like debate has all of these creative arguments about the state of the world, about the state of injustice, about the state itself, the government, we don't actually change our opinions. We don't actually change our values or our viewpoints or perspectives on the world as a result of a debate round. And so debate only considers what happens in the round itself, because ultimately nothing outside of it even matters. None of those out-of-round impacts that I talked about with policymaking education, none of them matter. All that matters is what happens in the debate round itself, because the debate round doesn't affect anything outside of the debate round. And finally, a lot of AF debaters will present an argument about how within the debate community itself, there is a lot of structural unfairness. And I personally do believe this is true. There is a lot of inequality in debate that results from race, from gender, from socioeconomic class, and especially from access to resources that is determined by the previous three. And so there is a lot of structural unfairness in the debate world in itself. But fairness debaters will say that this is truly impossible to combat via the debate round, in that I might present my 7-minute or 6-minute 1AC talking about how the debate world, the debate community in itself is very unfair, that it specifically targets minorities, that it specifically targets women, that it specifically targets people who don't have access to resources. But fairness debaters will say nothing that happens in the debate round actually changes that. That your 1AC talking about the community doesn't change anything. And in a way, they're right, because K-AF debate has existed for a very long time. But equity in the debate world has really not occurred. And so it might appear as though all of these KAFs, all of these arguments that we need to change the debate community from within debate rounds themselves don't actually change the debate community. So we can't change structural fairness. Structural fairness, unfairness, will always exist in the debate community, and so we might as well just accept that it's always going to exist. But there is a fairness that we do have control over. There's a fairness that we as individuals can choose to occur in our debate rounds, or we can choose to not occur in our debate rounds, and that's procedural fairness. Because procedural fairness is specifically dictated by the debaters themselves. And so even if there are inequities outside of the debate round, we two debaters, just two people, can decide to follow the rules to establish a balance between ourselves that prevents the debate from being skewed to one side or another. And in that way, at least we get some marginal benefit. Even if we don't change the debate community, we can at least make sure that procedural fairness exists, that the debate round will be fair. And so, like I said before, fairness doesn't really have any out-of-round impacts in that you can't really talk about how anything that happens outside of debate will actually matter. I contest this personally in that I think that fairness does actually have a tangible impact. If you personally feel that you're entering into a debate round that is unfair, then you're like this kind of links to competitive incentive, but you're unwilling to do proper good research for the next debate round, for the next debate tournament. And so this in turn impacts, for example, your research abilities, your interest in government or academia, and ultimately ends up influencing what life you might lead outside of the round. If you enter into the debate round, every single debate round, and it's extremely unfair and skewed, you're probably going to use that to help influence your worldview and influence the way that you move through the world yourself. And so that's just my personal take in that fairness does have out-of-round impacts. But it's important to note that if you don't run out-of-round impacts, if you say that only in-round impacts matter, then in the rest of your debate flow, for example, on the case debate, you have to specifically state that only in-round impacts matter. It's very difficult to run both framework fairness and say that, for example, we should only be considering the rules of the game, and also run a K that specifically talks about how what we talk about in debate also matters. So that those two arguments in that case would not be perf-con, in that you are contradicting yourself and you would probably lose the debate. So if you are running T framework and you're using fairness impacts and you're only considering in-round fairness impacts, make sure to specifically state in the rest of your case that you're only considering in-round impacts as well. Okay, so when we get into from the impact argument, from the impact debate into the internal link debate, that is, how do we connect the ASP model of debate to education in fairness, there are a wide variety of links that debaters will present. It's like a DA, honestly, in that there's literally no way that you can prepare for every single possible outcome. It's not like theory or T, in that most of the main links, like ground, like research, have already been covered and will be covered by debaters. It's not predictable in that sense. But there are a lot of popular ones that I can help set you up with beforehand so that when you go out into the world and you're presented with internal links that you maybe have not heard before, they're probably going to be similar to these ones, or they're probably going to present some alternative links that are these ones. And so in that way, you'll be prepared. And also just in general, a lot of the links that debaters use can be found online somewhere and in OpenEv. And so as long as you understand the basic structure of internal links, you should be fine. The most popular link by far in framework debate is switch side debate, at least when you're in arguing on the NIC against a non-TF. And switch side debate, or SSD, basically says that there is a tangible benefit from understanding, from researching, from arguing for both sides of debate. And this is the idea that when at a debate tournament, right, you don't just have AF for all 6 rounds, right? You aren't allowed to just run the same case for all 6 rounds. Beforehand, you have to research the AF case and you have to research the opposing neg case. So if the topic was, for example, implementing a carbon tax, I personally am very much for implementing a carbon pricing scheme. But it's important to also be able to ask questions about the other side as well, not just from your own perspective, but from the perspective of the other side itself. That's why we have an AF, a debate round where you're AF, and then the next round you're neg, and then AF and the neg, and then AF and neg again. So in-round impacts occur when we have this better research, these better research skills. Because not only do we just confirm the belief that we already do, for example, by choosing the AF side, but we're also forced to try and confront opposing beliefs as well. By developing these better research skills, we become better truth testers. And so in round itself, we're better able to interrogate the opposing side. So even if, for example, we're on a side that we don't necessarily believe, by being forced to oppose the AF, or to oppose the side that we actually do believe, we're better able to consider all possible arguments. That makes us better truth testers. Out-of-round impacts are probably a lot more intuitive in that when we consider multiple perspectives, we become much better, much more open-minded debaters and become better people as a result as well. And so when we do become policymakers and activists, we're better able to justify the beliefs that we do have because we're better able to interrogate the beliefs that we don't have. We don't just continuously confirm and confirm and confirm the ones that we have. we actually consider what other people are talking about and consider the specific logical flaws in their argumentation. That makes us better policymakers and activists because rather than being seen, for example, as a screaming horde, we're intelligent, mindful, and open-minded people who have already considered opposing sides and have compiled specific arguments against those sides. And a popular justification for this, for these out-of-round impacts, is a piece of evidence from an interview given to Malcolm X, in which he stated, or I believe it was in a book, I don't know the specifics, sorry, but specifically talking about how Malcolm X, before a debate with an opponent, he would mimic debating as the opponent, as the person that he would end up debating, and then he would respond to it as himself. And so in that way, he would talk to himself, both as himself and as the opposing debater. And in doing so, he became a better debater overall. Because although he still held steadfast to his beliefs, he was now able to see the world from his opponent's perspective, and in doing so, find the logical flaws in his opponent's perspective. So this idea of switch side debate, this idea of being able to go back and forth between your own opinion and your opponent's opinion, ultimately does have a tangible value outside of debate. The second main link that you're going to see, and this is a link that you've definitely seen before in T in theory as well, is limits. This applies to both education and fairness. And limits, as the name implies, is just talking about creating some sort of limit in the debate round about what the debaters can talk about how much time they have, about how many cases that they can run in a debate round. When we talk about framework, we're specifically going to be talking about materials, about topics, about what topics that the app can talk about in round. And so if you're responding to a non-T app, obviously you're going to be constricted by the topic set by the resolution. And so there are tangible benefits of having limits in a debate round. For example, for specifically talking about education benefits, when we have limits and we aren't just allowed to talk about everything that goes on in academia, which is practically an infinite amount of research, an infinite amount of information, we don't have to prep as many A2 arguments. We don't have to consider all the possibilities of what the app might run. Instead, we can focus on a very narrow, very specific region of academia. And in doing so, we can establish research that has a lot more depth and a lot less breadth. We can focus on all of the specific arguments within that specific subfield of academia. And in doing so, we can construct much more nuanced, much better research in the debate round itself. When we talk about fairness, limits becomes a lot more intuitive, because if the app, for example, is allowed to talk about whatever they want, this presents an unfair burden on the neg. Like I said, they'd have to prepare A2s to every single topic that exists in academia, which is practically impossible. And so, like I said, this presents a burden for the neg and skews the round in the app's favor. And there are some app debaters who might say that the debate structure in itself is already skewed towards the neg, and so the app needs some upper hand. For example, they'll talk about how the app, in policy debate at least, is forced to present a 5-minute 1AR to a 13-minute neg block, which is brutal, and they might say that skews the app in their favor so they can talk about whatever they want. But just as a general opposition to that argument, there's, first of all, the fact that the app begins and ends the debate round, so that gives them both the introductory glance at their case and also gives them the closing remarks, which benefits them. And also, the app just in general starts out the debate. They present the model that exists at the start of the debate round, and so it's on the neg to contest that model rather than being able to just present their own model for themselves and have them both start off on an equal foot. And the app gets the upper hand in that case. And so in general, that counters any arguments that the app might present that they get to talk about whatever they want. The final main popular link that debaters will present is predictability. And this is similar to limits, but it's a little bit more nuanced in that there are benefits to already knowing what you're going to talk about beforehand. Because when we have a topic, a pre-prepared topic, like carbon tax, like criminal justice reform, we're able to construct arguments that are much better. Because if you think about it, if you're in a debate round, and I'm sure a lot of you have been in such a case, if you're in a debate round in which your opponent presents a completely new argument, and you're forced to run a generic argument, for example, that you that you haven't put a lot of time and love and effort into, it's not going to be as good. It's going to be a lot more off the cuff, and it's not going to have as much merit. It's not going to have as reputable sources. It's not going to be good research. It's going to be a generic. And so predictability means that we're going to be able to develop arguments that aren't generic, that are specific, that use authors that are well known and that are reputable. And so in this, we get the education impacts. We're able to develop better research skills, and it prevents debate from just devolving into people running back files that they've only ever seen once in their life. It means that the topics that we're talking about in debate are actually going to be meaningful, instead of just off the cuff, extemporaneous arguments. When we talk about fairness, again, fairness for predictability, it's a little bit more intuitive, in that when we both know that we're entering into debate round with the same topic, we're both entering in on an even foot. Whereas if the neg believes that we're just talking about climate change, or we're just talking about education, and the AF thinks that we're allowed to talk about any academic topic in the world, then obviously the AF has a much smaller burden than the neg. Because when they get into the debate round, the AF has a lot more options to pick from if they're not following the resolution. Whereas if the neg is following the resolution, then they're a lot more limited. And so having this predictability, having this knowledge that both of you are coming in on an even foot, rather than one person cheating the rules and having a wide array of topics, means that you can prepare for the debate round much better. And you can truly believe that you're entering into the debate round on an even foot. And so again, these are just 3 internal links. They're probably the 3 most popular ones, but there are a lot more that debaters and that I myself have run, because they're a lot more specific and tailored to the unique AF that the 1AC that the AF presents. So now we're going to get into non-T AFs and how to respond to them and how to defend them. So just personally speaking, I have never run a non-T AF in my life, so I have a lot more information to give to you on how to respond to non-T AFs, but I'll also give you a little bit on how to defend non-T AFs as well. But just know that this is my specialty here. So the most beneficial argument that you can run on the neg against a non-T AF, like a KAF, is a topical version of the affirmative. And what you're going to do is you're just going to present a plain text, or if the resolution isn't policy action, a statement, an advocacy that follows the resolution. And you're not going to argue for the topical version of the affirmative, as it is called, or TVA. You're going to argue why the TVA that you presented generates the same level of debate or the same clash that would originate from the debater running their KAF. And so on the KAF, just as an example, the AF might say that there isn't enough discussion about race in debate because of the topics that are presented by the NSDA. And this is a valid complaint. After all, a lot of the debate, a lot of the resolutions consider policy action, for example, but they don't consider the perspective from the non-policymakers' perspective, from the activists, for example. And as such, we never talk about activism, about how grassroots movements outside of government can lead to tangible change, because resolutions are all stated from the perspective of the state. However, there are ways in which you can talk about activism even from the state's perspective. For example, you can talk about how the state can incorporate popular activist movements into legislation itself. A lot of activist movements themselves become produce tangible impacts the moment they are included in government. Of course, the AF might argue against that, but the point is not about the efficacy of the TVA. The point is that you're talking about the TVA. The point is that in the debate round, if the AF had presented a topical version of the affirmative, it might not have been good, but there would have been many tangible arguments that the neg could have presented that would lead to the same discussions about race, about activism, about justice, in the exact same way as the round in which the AF presented their KAF. And so through the TVA, you show that there is no reason to run a KAF, because even though the topical version might not be good, you're still talking about the topics that the AF wants to talk about. So you don't need to be non-topical when you're talking about those topics, although that's a general assumption. The second main argument that you're going to present when you're responding to a non-T AF is role of the ballot or role of the judge. And these are essentially the same thing. The AF might tweak it a little bit, so they're talking about specifically the judge, or they might be specifically talking about the ballot itself. Just as an example, I know a while back the topic in policy was education, and so one KF said that the role of the judge was to act as an educator themselves. A lot of debaters will come up with diverse interpretations of what this means, but generally speaking, role of the ballot or role of the judge talks about what the ballot or the judge signifies in the round. What does it do when? What does the judge do when they vote for a KF over a policy neg? What are they signifying to the debate community, and what impact does it have? And this typically won't be included in the framework shell itself. The AF will usually have it tucked in at the end of their AF, just to generally talk about what the debate round should signify to the world. So you can typically argue it on the AF's flow instead of your own framework T-shell. But generally speaking, the AF is going to say that the ballot or the judge has some benefit, has some role outside of the debate round to further some cause. For example, if the KF is again talking about how the debate community doesn't support and doesn't consider racial minorities or the perspectives of racial minorities, then they might say that the role of the ballot is for racial minorities in debate. By voting for the AF, the judge is doing something tangible and is saying that they support racial minorities in debate, and they support arguments about experiences of racial minorities in debate, even if the resolution doesn't say so. So they'll say that the ballot has some significance out of round. And you probably already think this as I'm saying it, but there are a lot of problems with this argument. First of all, it's contingent on the judge actually believing in the AF's experiences that they're talking about. Because once you say that the role of the ballot is no longer to determine the objective, better debater, who did the best debating, it's now to determine who has the most pertinent personal experiences, that allows the judge to inject their own personal ideologies into the round. And sure, it's beneficial if the judge does actually believe that the opinions and beliefs and experiences of racial minorities belong in debate, but it can become extremely violent. It can become, it can turn the AF if, for example, the judge has violent beliefs. If the judge believes that race should not play a role at all in the debate community, and that the KF is detrimental to the world, the KF might legitimately be a better debater. They might have presented better arguments against you on the neg. But if the judge believes in the neg, personally believes in the neg, then their role of the ballot or role of the judge gives them free license to just vote for whatever opinion, whatever ideology they personally believe. And that's bad, because it can easily turn the AF's arguments. And so that's just one reason why the role of the ballot should only be who did the better debating. There are a lot of different interpretations about what role of the ballot or role of the judge is, but generally speaking, it operates on the same level as framework. It's just talking about what is the significance of the debate round and who should win the debate round, and based on what merits. But again, it doesn't have to necessarily be run in the framework shell itself. And so the final main argument that you'll use against non-TF specifically is this idea of parametricization. This is just a fancy word that means plans, like plan text. And so parametricization good says that we should have plan text in round. And parametricization bad says that plans are not good, that we shouldn't have them in round, and we should just be considering general advocacies or statements. And so on the neg, although you might be opposing a non-TF, they might also have a plan text in itself. And so on the neg, you can run plans good or plans bad. Furthermore, in LD, for example, the AF might not necessarily present a plan text even if they're resolutional. They might just, for example, a topic a while back was that there ought to be criminal justice reform, something like that. And so the AF might just say, yeah, there ought to be criminal justice reform. They might not present a plan, but they might still be resolution. So you on the neg need to provide some opposing argument as to why plans are good or why plans are bad. So first, when we talk about why plans are good, the typical argument in favor of this is semantics. And that's that we should take the resolution as literally as possible and present plan text that is as specific an implementation of the resolution as possible. And the typical way to run this argument is, as I'm sure you've heard of before, nibblety. This is basically just the argument that semantics are the most important way of evaluating whether or not an AF is topical or not. And if they don't present a plan text, then they're not topical because they're not interpreting the resolution literally, which literally said that there should be criminal justice reform. And so you should implement criminal justice reform. And so the typical arguments for why you should want semantics, for why you should want specificity in debate round, is just because it provides better clash in that you're actually able to talk about the specifics of the app instead of just the generals of moral obligations and morality and ethics and stuff like that. Furthermore, if you have a specific plain text, it prevents the app from a cop-out, right? From, for example, presenting a vague advocacy in the 1AC, and then the neg provides specific arguments, for example, against the specific points of the app. And then the app in the 1AR will say, oh, no, 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 no. I didn't intend to consider all of those arguments that the neg brought up. I had a specific implementation of the advocacy in the 1AC that the neg should have just automatically incorporated into the 1AC. I should have assumed that the 1AC was. And so having a specific 1AC to start out with prevents the app from doing that, from shifting positions, from shifting the goalposts in the 1AR or the 2AR, and make sure that the app, the moment they say the 1AC is fixed in the 1AC, they're stuck with it. And so on the opposing side, if you, for example, say that plans are bad, and the app, for example, should provide a more vague interpretation of the resolution and should maximize the resolution to the should maximize the resolution, that is, implement all possible versions of plain text rather than just one specific plain text. You're again going to try and consider the more pragmatic benefits of debate in itself. For example, does it really matter to do we get any benefit from talking about the funding of the plain text? This is especially true in parley debate, where you have to specify where your funding for your plan comes from. Like, do we actually get any benefit from talking about that? Do we learn more about the world when we talk about how much we're going to tax, the 1% to fund our plan? I mean, really, no, we're not going to get any benefit from talking about the specifics of the plan, from how it's going to be implemented. All that really matters is the plan topic itself, that is the resolution. And so when we implement a specific plan text, all that ends up happening is the debate round devolves into bitter technicality arguments that don't actually educate us better. So that's just a general example in which you might say that it's bad for the app to not present a plan and that they should be topical to the maximum possible extent by fulfilling the entire resolution. But generally speaking, you're going to run semantics. You're going to run plans good because most non-T apps will not present a plan. They'll just present an advocacy. So those are all of the in-round impacts of in-round impacts that you would use in opposing a non-T app. However, the really interesting arguments against non-T apps happen out of round. That is, how does the discussion, how does the rhetoric that the app uses, how does that influence us outside of the round and influence us in how we move through the world, how we act as policymakers, as activists, as academics? And so there are a huge amount of arguments that debaters will use as out-of-round impacts against non-T apps. You can just look them up online and you'll see the sheer amount of arguments that debaters have. But generally speaking, these are most of the popular ones. And so the first two, static coalitions and static identity, talk about how essentializing the app is. And so the first argument, the static coalitions DA, talks about how the app prevents a movement. Right? The app is specifically talking about one context in the world, about race, about gender, about those two factors in the debate community specifically. They might talk about intersectionality. They might talk about how the state is bad. They might present, for example, an argument for Baudrillard about postmodernism. It doesn't matter. The point is that they're not talking about everything, right? The app has a theme. They have a thesis statement. And that thesis statement is inherently limited in that it only considers one movement. And if you look throughout history, these broad movements that are based on grand narratives, like the Communist Revolution, like the Black Panther movement, like Occupy Wall Street, all of them are motivated by specific, by very narrow interpretations of the world. And so with these narrow interpretations come flaws. Just as an example, the Marxist movement discounted the role that racial minorities play as the primary laborers for the metropole and colonialist systems. Or if you look at the Black Power movement, it mostly discounted the role that women play and the specific oppression that Black women experience in the United States. There are lots of examples of this, certainly, but just in general, broad movements that paint broad brushstrokes about the world will have flaws and will discount some other movement in the world. And so that's one main issue with having these static coalitions, these static movements that only consider one topic or one part of the world. Another argument against static coalitions is this idea of purges. That is, if you don't believe in the static coalition, by the logic of the static coalition, you shouldn't exist in the world. And obviously, this doesn't really have any role in the world to play when the static coalitions come from oppressed groups who don't actually have major state power, for example, or major military power. But there are instances in history in which static coalitions and movements have acquired this power and have used it to suppress dissent to an enormous extent. And the most obvious examples, for example, that you're probably thinking about right now is communism, and how the main objective of, for example, the Stalinist state or the Mao state was to suppress dissent and to enact this static coalition that didn't tolerate anybody who disagreed. And so the problem with having these static coalitions is this idea of purges, or purges DA, that if the static coalition does succeed, then ultimately anybody who ends up on the other foot, who ends up without power but still opposes the static coalition, will be purged, per se. The next main argument against non-TAFs is this idea of a static identity, and that's that AFs will typically only talk about, for example, race or gender from a very broad lens, and that lens typically excludes certain people. Just as an example, last week I presented an Afro-pessimism lecture that talked about Wilderson's arguments, and Wilderson, sorry, oh yeah, Rudy, that's fine. Thanks for coming. Sure, yeah, of course. Wilderson said that, when we were talking about Wilderson, we talked about Afro-pessimism generally. One of Wilderson's arguments is that biracial people who are both black and white aren't actually black. They don't have black identity. He doesn't believe that biracial people exist, which is, I mean, it's insane. It's a horrible argument that that excludes biracial people from specific communities in the world. And so the problem with a lot of these movements is that they have very essentializing claims about what the identity of their movement is. And so in doing so, they're going to exclude certain people. A really popular argument that you'll see against non-TAFs is this idea of cede the political, or CTP. And this is basically just saying that when you abdicate responsibility over the state, when you say that no matter who we elect in government, it doesn't matter, so we might as well just not vote at all you're doing is giving up that power that you would have had to your opponents. And not just, if you're, for example, a communist, you're not giving up power to liberals, you're giving up power to far-right people who will ultimately use the vacancy that you left behind to enact their own idea of what the world should be like, using the power that they've been given by the state. And so this idea of cede the political is that no matter what happens, as soon as you decide to surrender the state, you're surrendering that power as well, and that ultimately turns your arguments too. And we're running a little bit short on time, so I'm gonna skip perms. Perms are pretty easy. It's just do the AF, It's do the AF in, you can do the, oh my God, I'm sorry. The perm basically says that the advocacy that the AF prevents, you can do it while also enacting state action. So you can, enact a topical version of the AF while also considering, activist movements. Okay, so now I'm gonna mention, again, I'm running a little bit late, so I'm gonna kind of breeze through this topic, which is defending non-TAFs. But generally, if you look at the first three main arguments, the idea of topical debate, right, is limiting in itself. And so you have all of these negative effects of trying to establish kind of these rigid rules on what debate should be like. One of them, for example, is that it's impossible to get a perfect debate, so debaters feel like they don't have any agency to explore for themselves. And so this leads to this a type of depression called ressentiment, which I'll talk about later. But generally speaking, debate, when it limits itself to topical debate, can't be fulfilling. That's just generally what the first three are talking about. The last main one is what I want to talk about, and that's fiat. So under topical debate, right, we assume fiat. We assume that no matter what happens, the plan is going to be implemented. And that's good, right? Because then we're talking about what actually matters in the debate. We're talking about the plan itself and the topic of the plan rather than plan implementation, which is mostly just semantic stuff that we don't really care about. But the problem that a non-TF might take with this is that although we might feel a benefit in a debate round from role playing, from acting as the state, once we go out into the world and experience the state as it is, we come up against all of these barriers, right? Like, it's not just easy to just say, oh, the plan will get implemented, right? Most of your work outside in the real world will be trying to get your plan implemented, not just trying to justify your plan. And so there's this idea of ressentiment, which is just a fancy word for passivity, that in debate, if you just assume fiat every single debate round, if you just be topical, if you just assume you're the state and that whatever you say will get passed, then you're going to develop this ressentiment, this idea that I have no idea what that means. I'm old. I'm sorry, Kessler. Sorry. But generally speaking, ressentiment just states that once you actually go out into the real world, nothing actually happens and you feel bad about it. It's similar to the depression DA in that debate presents this idealized idea of what discourse is like, but that doesn't actually end up happening. And what actually does end up happening is we just get discouraged. And because it seems so hard, because frankly, we're lazy and debate makes us lazy, we just abdicate all the responsibility and we go live our own lives instead of taking responsibility in the world. And so that's typically run as a K. And like I said, I didn't run any non-TFs, but I did occasionally run this on the neg as a K. And so it's beneficial both as a defense of a non-TF and when you're trying to oppose TFs. Okay, so that was the first part of the lecture. I'm sorry, I'm running a little bit long, but this second half should pass by very quickly. This is debate as we know it. And so when we talk about debate impacts, for example, nuclear war, soft left impacts like mitigating structural oppression, moral impacts like defending liberty or defending human rights, or what's another popular policy impact? Global warming is another very popular one, and just in general, human extinction has an impact. All of these are very different impacts, right? And although we might compare, similar impacts to each other, a lot of them operate on very different levels. For example, extinction impacts don't really clash well with human rights impacts because human rights come from a very different place. They assume that there's something sacred about individual liberties and that is lost as the moment they are violated. Whereas human extinction really deals with these ginormous events and says that anything that might seem small, for example, violation of human rights, but doesn't actually lead to a tangible negative impact, doesn't really matter. And the reason is because they are actually operating on different levels. If you remember that table that I presented at the beginning of the lecture, how there are 4 layers of debate, framework, the first layer was just talking about debate itself, right? Like what type of arguments we want to see in debate. But framing is specifically about the impacts themselves, right? Like which impacts should we be talking about in debate? And so when we talk about these impacts, we're not talking about what actually occurs in the world or, will this plan kill more people than my opponent's plan, which is a really macabre example, but just in general, right? We typically measure plans by how many human lives they save or kill. And so they're not talking about, this kind of cost-benefit analysis. Instead, they're talking about the ethical underpinnings of the impacts themselves. And so when we talk about, for example, state action, and when we're evaluating different things like human rights and human lives and security, for example, we're not talking about impact calculus. We're talking about framing. Framing in general is the layer of debate that talks about the ethical basis of the impacts themselves. And so it typically depends on what debate style or what debate event you're doing. In that, for example, policy debate, most policy debates, you won't need a framing layer at all because you'll typically agree on existentialist impacts. But it's similar to framework in that sometimes, and this will happen a lot in debate, you'll need to establish a framing argument just because your opponent will disagree with you. They might say human rights is more important than existentialist impacts, but all of your cases might just be based on existentialist impacts. And so you'll need to talk about framing if you do disagree with your opponent, with the AF's model of impact calculus. And so I put a question mark there just because, again, it really depends on the debate event that you're doing. For example, in LD, you will be doing this a lot. Every single debate round, you will be running a value-value criterion in lay debate. And typically, even once you get into the circuit debate, you'll just run a standard. It'll depend on the debate round. But just like I said, for parley debate, especially for PF and sometimes for policy, you typically won't need a framing argument. You won't need a framing layer in the debate. So again, you only use a framing layer once you disagree with the AST model of impact calculus. So when we talk about framing, and when we talk about how we decide which impacts matter more than others, there are three main ways we can justify our impacts: consequentialism, deontology, and virtue ethics. This is philosophy, just saying. It's Phil debate. But so the first main tenet is consequentialism, and this is the one that we're typically all familiar with. This basically says, okay, what are the direct benefits of my action? What are the direct negatives of my action? If the benefits exceed the negatives, then it's a moral action. And when we're comparing between two sides, for example, the world of the AF and the world of the neg, then if the AF produces a greater net benefit than the neg, then the AF wins. That's the essential idea of consequentialism. And utilitarianism is probably the most obvious example of consequentialism, in that it evaluates the utility of an action or the general happiness or welfare that is produced by an action. The second main ethical framework that you'll see is deontology. And deontology is this idea of human rights, right? Like, there are certain things that just cannot be broken, certain contracts, certain rights that cannot be breached. And so when we consider an action, we're not going to consider its morality based on the product of that action, what actually happens. We're going to be considering at the actual ethical intent behind the action. So it doesn't matter if, for example, my plan to save the world from global warming involves, I don't know, nationalizing the energy industry in the United States. If I personally believe that nationalization as a policy violates human rights or violates individual liberty, then the plan is immoral. It doesn't matter what benefits come as a result of it. It's just immoral because it violated this certain code, this certain rule. And that's deontology. And the final ethical framework, which you probably won't ever see in debate, but it's important because occasionally it'll come up, is virtue ethics. And this is different from deontology and consequentialism in that we're not deciding its morality based on the action, we're deciding it based on the person. And so it's kind of empirical in that sense, in that we don't automatically say one action is good or not. We say, what type of person would commit this action, or what type of person would not commit this action? And if the type of person who would commit this action is virtuous, then the action is moral. And if they're not virtuous, then the action is immoral. And obviously, this is really convoluted, and that's why it doesn't work well in debate. But just generally speaking, it means that morality is motivated by people themselves, that we decide who is virtuous just by our own intuition. And so using causality, we determine that anything that those people do is virtuous. Now, obviously, there are lots of flaws in that logic, and that's why, generally speaking, it's not good to run virtue ethics as a framing argument. So that was framing. That was how do we justify our method of impact calculus. Now we are finally at the third and fourth levels of debate, which is impact calculus itself. And this is debate as we know it. This is policy debate. This is talking about, my plan will kill less people than your plan. My plan solves global warming, whereas yours only mitigates it to a small extent. And although it might seem simple, there are 5 main ways in which you can do impact calculus, in which you can compare your plan or your neg position to your opponent's. And the first one is the most obvious one, is magnitude. And this is just a question of how much of an impact does it have on the world. So if my plan saves the entire human race from extinction, then that's 7 billion lives saved. Whereas if my opponent's plan or my opponent's advocacy just saves, 2 billion people, or just helps 2 billion people by offering aid to them, then by sheer magnitude, obviously the first plan will be better, just because it saves more lives. And that's, again, under a utilitarian framework. It's possible to evaluate magnitude under deontological frameworks too. The second main category is probability. So sure, maybe at first it might seem like a plan that saves 7 billion people is more important than a plan that saves 2 billion people. But if, for example, the plan that saves 7 billion people is from a nuclear war that has very little chance of occurring because there's no state today who would willingly use nuclear weapons, then it has a very low probability of actually happening. Whereas if my plan to save 2 billion people is from global warming, which is literally happening right now, and therefore has a 100% probability of happening, although you might, have a question about what happens in the future. The point is that what matters most is what actually happens. Also, Kessler, thank you so much for coming. Of course, you can leave once you want to.
Thank you for teaching.
Sure, of course. After probability, we're going to consider time frame. And again, this is just an argument about, this is similar to probability in that we're considering it's not similar to probability at all, sorry. It's just we're going to consider when the event actually happens. I was going to say it's similar to the situation that we were talking about before. So if, for example, there's a plan that can prevent 7 billion people's lives from being saved, and it happens today, right? If that impact is going to happen in the near future, then it's more important than, for example, a plan that mitigates global warming for 2 billion people, if the actual detrimental impacts of global warming are only going to start occurring 50 or 100 years from now. So that's why we consider plans that occur more, plans whose impacts occur more recently, we consider those impacts to be more important. And generally speaking, this is pretty irrational because obviously, like, if a plan saves 5 million lives tomorrow, it's probably going to have the same general impact as a plan that saves 5 million lives in 10 years, because those 5 million lives, they still matter regardless of the time period. But generally speaking, we want results quicker. So that's why we consider time frame to be important. The fourth main category is scope. And scope is similar to magnitude in that we're considering how many people are affected. But generally speaking, when we articulate scope, we don't talk about the number of bodies that are saved, right? The number of people. We instead talk about the general diversity or the general variety of people that are saved. So just as an example, right? Like, we might believe that two plans that save 5 million people are both of equally the same merit, right? But if the 5 million people that are saved in one plan are just the general population as a whole, and then the other 5 million people are specifically people who have been sentenced by the state to execution. I know those 5 million people are clearly, like, obviously the state doesn't execute 5 million people each year, but let's just suppose that they're, people who are executed. The point is that it specifically matters I guess it specifically matters how wide of a variety each group is. And the point is that the first group has a greater variety of people, right? We're considering the general population. And so the probability that any individual in the population is going to be good or moral or immoral is, generally speaking, it's just equal to the probability that you would consider in the general population as a whole. Whereas in the second plan, we're just considering criminals, right? People who have been sentenced to the state by execution. And so the scope of people that we're considering in the second group is not equal to and does not attain the same level of scope as the first plan. So that's why we consider the first plan to be more important. And the final level of impact calculus that we're going to consider is reversibility. And so this is this idea that, like, nothing matters if we're all going to die, right? Like, I have a plan, for example, that saves human extinction, prevents human extinction from happening in 7 years. But suppose, I don't know, maybe life will go on after human extinction occurs, and I don't know, a new race of intelligent animals will, I don't know, develop a new civilization or whatever. Sorry, that's really out of here. But the point is that my opponent might say that their plan prevents Earth from being destroyed. And so in doing so, they have a higher tangible magnitude, right? Because any civilizations or any races that might develop into substantial human civilizations afterwards, that will never happen, right? And so they're just generally, the magnitude is bigger. But the point is that the extinction of the human race is not reversible. We might think that, a new civilization coming up after we all go, that might also be an important impact. But ultimately, nothing matters after we all become extinct. And so even if I present a plan that or actually that wasn't a good example. Here's a better example. Okay, so I'm on the app, and I believe that utilitarian impacts matter. And I'll say just as before that my plan prevents human extinction. But I'm on the neg, and I believe that util also matters, but I believe that mitigating structural oppression is going to be my framing mechanism. It's going to be my impacts, right? Both of them are utilitarian impacts. And if we're just disregarding magnitude for now, if we're just considering reversibility, human extinction is a more important impact than mitigating structural oppression. Because although structural oppression does occur in the status quo and will occur in the future, structural oppression can still be reversed even after it happens. Whereas human extinction, the moment it occurs, cannot be reversed. So that's why, although both impacts might still be considered under utilitarianism, both extinction and um, structural oppression, the point is that we should consider extinction, just because if we let extinction happen, we can't go back later and say, okay, let's implement another policy to, prevent human extinction from happening in the first place. The moment it happens, it's done. Everything's done. There's nothing you can do to reverse it. And so that's why we should prioritize plans that consider, for example, this is a popular way of expressing it, prerequisites to other impacts. Because you can't have structural oppression, or you can't mitigate structural oppression without first preventing human extinction. That's why we should consider reversibility. So those are the 5 main categories of evaluation. And generally speaking, when you do impact calculus, there are a lot of ways in which you can approach it, but especially when you're considering the overview in your last speech, right? When you're directly establishing clash between your impacts and your opponent impacts, there are a lot of things that you can do to really up your impact calculus game. And the first idea is this impact filter. So in your 1AC, you might have a laundry list of impacts, right, that all matter and that are all better than your negs. But once you get down to the core of your AF in the 2AR, you should condense down to a single impact. One impact that is more important than all of the rest and negates everything that the neg presents, just so that you can consolidate your thoughts in that single impact, and you can truly show how that single impact matters more than everything else, rather than spending your 3-minute 2AR trying to get through every single impact. It's not worth it. It's much better to filter out the worst impacts and just go for the 1 or 2 main impacts that are most important. Next, it's important to actually compare impacts that are comparable. Because, okay, I presented the argument before about structural oppression and extinction, right? And those are both utilitarian impacts, but it's really difficult to compare them directly via magnitude, right? And so I might, for example, if I'm on AF and I'm arguing for extinction, I might say, oh, well, extinction prevents greater lives from dying, and so obviously it's more important, right? I mean, technically that's true, but there's not a lot of clash, right? Because that's not where you differ in belief, right? It's not about the magnitude, it's about the scope. And so when I say compare apples to apples, I'm saying you should compare on the same category that each impact is considering to be most important, right? So if you're on the AF and your opponent is saying that structural oppression is the most important impact, they're going for scope. They believe that scope is the most important category of their impact. And so you should make sure to oppose that specific category rather than going for something that they aren't even actually advocating for. And finally, this last point, it holds for literally everything in debate: use evidence. And I included a document full of evidence cards for every single impact imaginable, specifically in policy debate. But just generally, try to get as recent evidence as possible, as reputable evidence as possible for your arguments. And your impact, your framing cards don't necessarily have to have the best evidence. After all, you're considering, what type of impact matter most in round. Are they utilitarian or deontological or whatever? But when you're actually considering the impact themselves, this type of detail on and the academic detail on magnitude or probability, they really matter in round. So just make sure to have those cards in your 1AC or your 1NC. And obviously in your 2AR, don't restate them, but just make sure to restate the names, the tags, or the authors of those cards, and just to, again, add that legitimacy to your impact calculus. Okay, so I had a drill in mind, but obviously I think most people have left by now, so I don't think we're going to be doing the drill today. For all of the 2 people who are remaining, thank you so much for staying through my lecture. And if you're watching the recorded version, yeah, thanks for watching. Do you have any questions about impact calculus, framing, anything? Okay, that's totally cool. If you do have any questions, just email me. I think I put it in the Google. Oh, okay, yeah, cool. Yeah, if you have any questions, email me. Look through the lecture. Look through the cards that I put up and the lecture notes that I put up. And yeah, just email me if you have any questions. Thank you.